Hello, everybody. Welcome to our viewers and to our panelists. We are the Environment Cluster at Nickel-Dime, which is the research tangent at Center for New Economic Studies. Today, we are here for our monthly roundtable, which is on the theme analyzing climate responsibility with special emphasis on India. And yeah, we are trying to focus on that particular theme, especially on the backdrop of very important COP26, which just took place, and the Glasgow Climate Pact, which was brought out as a result of that. So before we begin our moderated discussion, Ashish here will give a very brief presentation on climate responsibility, differentiated responsibility, and along the lines. I request Ashish to take over. Before that, I have to make.
Hello, everyone. Yes, please make me host.
Yeah, it's all right now, Ashish. Go on.
Okay, just a sec. Let me know if you can see my screen.
Yes, it's visible.
Okay. Hello, everyone, to this environment and social issues cluster. So we are discussing this theme of common but differentiated responsibility today. So as you know, for most of developing countries, this theme, CBDR, common but differentiated responsibility, this is forming the core of the climate negotiations. So this is what we are going to focus on today. So moving on. So common but differentiated responsibility is a principle within the UNFCCC that acknowledges the different capabilities and different responsibilities of individual countries in addressing climate change. Now, what this thing means is, historically, countries of the global north, mostly, like if I were to generalize it, these countries have sort of fueled their development trajectories out to the present by burning coal, petroleum, etc. Now currently, like the entire mass of CO2, methane, etc. that we have in the atmosphere, a lot of that can be credited or traced back to these countries of the global north. So historic responsibility that bears on them. But now, when the effects of climate change are most prominent, so developing countries have also recognized the need to cut down on their emissions, but not at the cost of their development and growth, right? That's like a moral stand that they have taken. So that's how they invoke this clause, which figured in the UNFCCC. Now, moving on. So this, and plus there's this RC, that is CBDR. RC stands for respective capabilities, which we talked about. So this is the guiding principle of all UN climate change negotiations, including the Glasgow summit. Based on this interesting fact, yesterday, I think Germany donated, like it's as an aid, I think around 1.2 billion to India to finance its climate change commitments. So things are progressing, but the 100 billion climate change aid package promised to developing countries by the developed countries back in around 2010, that has still not materialized. So this is a graph, a chart rather. So you'll see the countries inside, the percentage of historic emissions that they are to be blamed for, if I were to use that word. You see in negative 34% historically. So you can, the sources are mentioned, you can go back to them and explore for yourself. This is an NYT graph. You see 170 years of CO2 emissions. So United States, then China, rest of the world, India is just this much. So you can make sense of this graph along those things. Then this is a controversial thing. So total emissions, India stands third. But when you look at it on a per capita basis, India, like compare the chart or the bar, you see it's 1.8. So this is how it boils down to. So you'll have to factor in India's population, inequality, access to energy sources, living patterns, etc. So, and then this is, I think, the last one. So you'll see just 23 developed nations of the world account for this much of emissions, while you'll see more than 150 countries account for the other half. So this is half and then this is half, and India is around at this place. So these graphs sort of, uh, they lay out the entire picture in front of you of they lay out the theme of what we are going to discuss today. And with this, we come to the end of this presentation, and we are moving right into the roundtable. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashish. That was very insightful. Now let's move on to our moderated discussion. The first question is that I want to pose to the panel is how much of the policy owners do you think, from a policy angle, do you think that climate action or policy that caters to climate action lies with developing countries? How much of the responsibility to climate action in terms of policy lies with developing countries? Anyone interested to answer that question can just unmute themselves and go.
Hi, shall I go first?
Yes, Sushameendra, please.
Yeah, I think in my opinion, not much of policy onus for climate action lies with developing countries, as it is with developed countries. It is true that we all need to collectively cut down our emissions to meet our target, but for that, developed and rich countries would sort of need to act first and lead our efforts, in my opinion. So for two reasons. First, there is a huge inequality when it comes to the per capita emissions of greenhouse gases, like how Ashish had showed through his presentation. On an average, US emissions are about 8.4 times the emissions of India. It is twice as that of China, despite having 1/4 of its population. On an absolute scale, it is true that developing countries like India and China lead the table, but it is sort of critical to take into consideration the vast population these countries support, and hence the necessity for energy. Second, it is an undeniable fact that climate action is expensive. Developing countries essentially make a choice between sustaining their vulnerable population and climate change. For example, countries near the equator in Africa have raging levels of poverty and with under 40% of households connected to power. To say that they spend their money to cut their emissions, which mind you would push hundreds of thousands of people to extreme poverty, is not morally right.
Thank you, Sushameendra. You brought a very insightful point, and actually you just put it in very simple words that climate action is actually very expensive, and that has so many complexities attached to it. So thank you for that point.
Okay, if there's no one else willing to add, we will move on to the next question. So I'll begin. What do you think is or are the reasons why Global North is not responding completely to its moral obligation, as we discussed, to its moral obligation of compensating the developing countries with dollars to finance climate action innovation? Repeat the
Shall I
question.
go again?
Why? Okay, if you want, you can.
Yeah. I think there are multiple reasons, and most of them are obviously political in nature. But putting these away for some time, there are some justified reasons why Global North is not fulfilling its financial funding obligations. Um, we'll have to look into why developed countries hesitate to sort of fund developing and underdeveloped countries. One is the political instability and frequent coups in the sub-Saharan countries and Latin American countries is, one predominant reason in my opinion. There have been 14 coups in the African continent alone in the past decade. Regions in Latin America like Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador continue to reel under the rule of warlords. In such countries, established governments are only a facade, and it is such people, such warlords who actually wield power. Funding such developing and underdeveloped countries under the pretext of climate action would be akin to fueling conflict in the region. There is actually no concrete guarantee that there would be no misuse of funds. Second is the corruption in all levels of government in developing countries. According to the Perceived Corruption Index table, which of late is making news in our country, Developing countries top the list with as much as 86% of funds being siphoned away by political leaders. It is understandable that donor countries fear that funds would be misused or mismanaged instead of acting concretely for transition to clean energy and hence for climate change.
Makes sense. Yeah. Would anyone else like to chime in?
I just like to sort of further flesh out the point that Sushameendra had made. So it's talked about how there's corruption at multiple levels of government, and this is in some sense more prevalent among developing countries or so. But it's also important to keep in mind that this is rather a structural problem that can't be immediately corrected as well. And therefore it should not be used as an excuse to withhold funds too, because the purpose for which these funds have been allocated, which is climate action, is time sensitive, right? While the sort of turning over of corruption and all of those may take time, there's sort of a time cap on how fast we need to act and within what time we can act with regards to climate change and when we can correct it and how fast we need to correct it. And therefore the withholding of funds therefore might not be fully justified. But as Sushameendra has pointed, the sort of uncertainty and to a certain extent politically shying away from doing so in some sense might be partly understandable.
Thank you, Sudarshan. That was a very insightful point as well. Let's now move on to our next question that I'd like to pose to our panelists. So, like, how can India start transitioning to net zero? Like, it has put commitments till say about 2070, if I'm not wrong. So it's aiming 2070 as a standard year where it targets net zero. Right. So what should be the pace of this transition, and how can they develop models in which they can start transitioning to net zero? Right. And what technologies, if you have anything in mind, are most fit for the historical reality and socio-political problems of India? Like, so there are three parts of the question, like, how can India start transitioning? What should be the pace? And how can it be inclusive to socio-political realities?
Yeah, I think I would like to just start up because I sort of in my mind, I have an idea of what India could do to start. And this is with relation to something that developed countries have sort of mastered, which is, energy efficiency. India has a lot of coal power plants, and most of them are very old, which leads to underutilization. They need more coal in order to produce less energy as compared to the newer, coal power plants. So what could be a good place to start is, shutting down of all the coal power plants, because it's kind of bringing down, um, the whole like energy output, and it's just adding to the pollution. So it's kind of like a negative cost that India is just carrying around. So I think that's a good place to start because it's been done in developed countries before, and I think it's it's something worthwhile that we could sort of emulate.
Let me also sort of chime in to add to that point and broadly summarize the factors in which I think India should focus on in the coming few years. So firstly, sort of putting in perspective what Ashika had just said, a large amount of India's power does come from coal plants, and which, as she said, are quite old. But the problem is that that number is not only indicative of the problems that we face, but also a certain amount of reliance on these power plants. And therefore, there's also a large amount of necessity to procure funds, which we just discussed before, and to also sort of nudge the financial sector of India uh, to invest more in technologies, in firms that are coming up with technologies that could promote energy efficiency and so on. And there's also broadly a set of a list of reasons, such as green mobility, and especially given India state right now, which is rapidly undergoing urbanization. The cities are increasingly being designed, sort of continuously being designed and redesigned, repurposed, and so on. And the most important point to keep in mind is it's very hard to in some sense, once the plans for cities are completely in place and then urbanized infrastructure is set in place, it's very hard to modify and therefore, in some sense, make them green. So, given the context of consistent, continuous urbanization in the country, it's very important to, in some sense, employ city planners, as we had discussed in our previous roundtable as well. And make sure that these cities are conducive to maintaining the sort of green lifestyle that we hope to have. And then obviously there's also multiple problems related to the transportation sector. There's been multiple reforms in the past years as to sort of discarding previous energy inefficient models of transportation or so on, especially in the motor vehicle, in particular the car segment of the sector. And so there's more progress to be made there. The introduction of electric cars is something that has been suggested worldwide, and hopefully something that can be taken up over the years consistently. And finally, with regards to agriculture, a large sector of India, and the sustainability of agriculture or so is very important too. So this is sort of the broad list of reasons I wanted to mention that India should ideally be focusing on in the next 10 to X number of decades, 10 years to X decades, to achieve the net zero economy that has been proposed.
Right.
If I could
Yes.
add one more point. Yeah, I just wanted to also bring up the fact that, only 5 states in India are responsible for producing, almost 85% of the coal. So in order for this transition to happen, like the switch of energy source, they'll have to shift this energy producing plants to completely different states. They are sort of mutually exclusive. So that sort of explains why India would take more time in order to transition to a net zero phase, because kind of relying on solar or wind would, require different geographical locations in itself. Which I think the time for sure is necessary, owing to other factors such as, if in these states the livelihood of at least some parts of the local populations completely dependent on these coal producing plants. Yeah, just wanted to bring up that point.
Yeah, I think those
And
are great
also,
points. Yeah, you want to add something, Asish? Go ahead.
yes, I agree. I agree, Krishanu. So if I were to chime in something, the amount of carbon that we have added to the atmosphere, that is something that cannot be just taken out by natural processes. At least that's what I have come to learn from the research that I have done, because that's just too much. And even if deforest the entire landmass that we have in this country, or at least half of it, even it's just not going to work out, because the amount of carbon that we have, that we are emitting into the atmosphere, which spreads, then it becomes global, it spreads out. That just will not go at the current rate, or even if the process starts, it's going to take decades. So to match the intensity with which we added carbon, the only thing that can match that intensity is technology, right? So we did that with technology. Now we have to did it back. We have to go back with technology, right? We have to take out this carbon that we have emitted, and the best way to do it is renewable energy, sustainable energy. We are like billions are being funded into this research and development effort. So sort of combining our contingencies with this one, with the R&D of sustainable energy, etc. That, and we are actually getting investment in this sector. So the future is bright in the sector of R&D, renewable energy, and if these two can be reconciled, then I think we will be able to hit right at our infrastructure demand, the population pressure, and the entire drive towards prosperity will be more sustainable within a growth framework, so that the cost of transition is least, and the lower the cost is, the more acceptable it is to political leadership, to masses, etc. So, frame upon which the UN operates, upon which nation states are operating, and I think it's quite possible, at least for mid-sized to large size, like developing countries like India, for example.
Yeah, thank you, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ashish, Sudarshan, and Ashika for those lovely points. Actually, I think, like Sudarshan also mentioned about this, that if we want to effectively, you know, what do you call it, make the power plants which are actually not working that well, like if we channel our funds to that side also, because of the dependency on those plants, because India derives a lot of its energy from coal, it will actually get India's energy economy in a state of limbo, because when you are treating the bad plants, you're also halting the process of energy generation. So I think that's a very important point. And also, as Ashika mentioned about the socio-economic reality, like what about the people who are going to lose out of jobs when you transition to renewable energy, right? Again, renewable energy doesn't have avenues, say in Jharkhand, where most of the coal plants are located. Like, what kind of renewable energy would you generate in Jharkhand? Like, you might be possibly inclined to do solar energy in Rajasthan or places nearby that state, but that would involve a lot of nuanced arguments, a lot of thought into transition process, and it's not so easy. And also Ashish's points that we should definitely leverage technology to get something out of to actually spearhead our climate action, right, instead of neglecting it altogether. So all of these are extremely well thought out points. I guess we can now move on to our final question, right?
Yep. So the last question for today is, how can the global north and the global south reconcile the difference in capabilities which arise due to asymmetrical disposition of financial, scientific, and technological resources? And what should be the way forward for a more sustainable and just climate action? The keyword here is just climate action. Would someone want to take that?
Right. Let me put forward the importance first of this, first of all, and then I'll move on to a few suggestions that can be taken up. So the question primarily focuses on the asymmetry of resources between the countries, and it's what there's one more perspective to this, that uh, there's a larger number of, there's a large amount of urgency attached to solving this asymmetry of resources towards climate action as well, because in developed countries, largely those who are affected by climate changes are the poor. So this is a cycle of repeating classes, right? It's the poor countries that are affected more by climate change, and it's the poorer of the poor in poor countries that are affected largely by climate change. And especially talking about the necessity and the urgency to finance these, as it was mentioned before as well, it's a large number of funds are required in order to repurpose multiple existing technologies and to introduce technologies to take up more efficient ways of energy usage and so. And let me sort of put this in the perspective of agriculture in India. This is something I wanted to bring up before as well. So I think the agricultural sector in India accounts for about north of 15% of greenhouse gas emissions or so, and 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 the sort of transition that has to take place in this sector is probably going to be one of the most intricate things that will have to be planned out, because we've got a section of the population, a large amount of whom are in or below or lie below the poverty line, and are therefore in the profession of subsistence agriculture and not commercial farming per se. And if you've got to incentivize them to take up these green technologies and energy efficient technologies, which will obviously cost more, then it requires a huge amount of subsidization, funding, and so. And so the summary overall is that there's not only the asymmetry in resources that has to be kept in mind, but also a certain urgency that has to sort of fuel this action, because it's broadly the of getting affected, and to therefore fund these immediately becomes that much more important. And so coming to a lot of which can be done, a lot of what can be done. So we talked about in some time ago about why there's some amount of hesitancy on the part of developing nations to fund uh, the sort of climate action fund or so. And I think the action there has to come primarily to solve that, because developing countries obviously are already trying to solve these problems by growing their economies, investing in funds or so. But given that given that in the first place, much of these emissions, much of the effects of these emissions, much of the emissions come from developed countries, but the effects of these emissions accrue to other countries as well. A lot of funds have to be appropriated from developing countries, and consistently so. And therefore, a problem that is most important to be solved is uh, uh, how do we sort of clear away the hesitance on their part. And I think that comes with a lot of internal structural reforms also, as we discussed before. There's got to be a lot of administrative reforms, in the sense that separate committees have to be set up who will in some sense properly manage account transactions taking place using the funds that have been appropriated to each country. Professionals have to be employed so that these funds, once they've been entrusted to these countries, can be trusted to go to the right place necessary. And so broadly, a stronger accountability framework rather than what already exists for the appropriation of funds, I think is one important thing. And obviously, as I mentioned, a whole host of structural reforms that curb corruption, if not for the whole economy, at least particularly for the appropriation of these funds, would be most desirable. That's about it I have in mind.
Perfect. Thank you, Sudarshan. Is there any last word if anyone wants to chime in? Else, we have reached the end of this session. Is there anything else you would like to add? Fine. I think we are done for today. And it's just that we would like to end on the note that all climate change negotiations, which are going to have a huge bearing on diplomacy in the coming years, coming decades, should always at every step factor in the concept of common but differentiated responsibility, and sort of financially support developing countries, right? Put their money where their mouth is. Else, if that's not done, if the foreign exchange does not come, developing countries might not be able to stand up to the requirements of the situation. So we are all in this together, and common but differentiated responsibility is something that needs to shine the way. So on that note, we would like to conclude, and Krishanu, you have the floor.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody. Very insightful, very active discussion on this part, and this comes at a very, very timely moment, especially at the backdrop of COP26, and especially when the discourse around climate responsibility is gaining momentum. And I feel our viewers and even the panelists have gained something from this discussion. And we'll see you next month. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for your participation.